The morning after Brittany Miller flinched away from my touch like I'd tracked mud into our bed. I walked into the kitchen with that dull, embarrassed quiet in my chest, expecting at least a look, or a sentence, or anything that admitted what happened was real. Instead, she moved like nothing had happened at all, barefoot on our cold tile, hair in a loose knot, one hand on the mug, the other scrolling her phone, and the normalcy was so clean it felt staged, like she'd erased last night and left me holding the shame by myself. I stood near the counter, watching the coffee drip, listening to the little clicks and sighs of the machine, and I kept waiting for her to say, "Hey, about last night." But she didn't even lift her eyes, like I was furniture that made noise. When she finally spoke, it wasn't an apology or curiosity, it was a request delivered like a bill, because she said she needed me to transfer $500 for a girl's day, and she said it with the same calm tone someone uses to remind you the rent is due. I don't mean she asked like a partner or explained where it was going, or even tried to make it sound like something we were doing together, because she said it like I was a payment app with a heartbeat, and my job was to comply. For a second I almost did what I always did, which was swallow my irritation, tell myself it wasn't worth a fight, and reach for my phone to keep the peace. But something in me didn't move this time, like a latch finally caught. I looked at her, really looked, and I saw how easy it was for her to act normal when I was the one carrying the sting. And that's when my mouth opened and the word came out before I could soften it, because I said no. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was sharp, like the air changed density. And Brittany's thumb stopped mid-scroll while her eyes finally lifted to me with that slow, disbelieving stare she used when reality didn't behave. She asked what I meant, like she hadn't heard the word, like it was a glitch, and I felt my heart beat steady in my throat while I realized I wasn't angry in a messy way. I was calm in a dangerous way. I told her I meant no, and I didn't add a lecture or a negotiation, or a list of reasons she could argue with later, because I wasn't trying to win a debate. I was drawing a line that didn't need her approval. Then she gave a small, tight laugh that wasn't humor and said something about how she has self-respect. Like that explained everything, and I watched her try to turn the moment into a moral lesson where I was the student. I set my mug down, looked her dead in the eye, and told her, as evenly as I could, that I have self-respect too, and the way her face changed in that second told me the fuse wasn't lit in the room, it was lit in her. Before Brittany Miller became the kind of woman who could flinch away from me and then ask for money like I was a service, she was the person who used to grab my hand in parking lots like she couldn't stand the distance between us for even a few steps. I'm Ryan Parker, 38, Senior Operations Manager in Minneapolis, which is a job that sounds cleaner than it feels, because it's deadlines, bottlenecks, angry emails, late calls, and the quiet pressure of being the guy who keeps the whole machine moving while everyone else complains about the noise. When Brittany and I started, we were broke in a way that made us creative instead of bitter, and we lived in a small apartment where the heater clicked like it was thinking about quitting, and we ate cheap takeout on the floor because the dining room was a corner that held a folding table. Those nights were simple and they were close because we'd split lo mein or tacos, laugh at dumb reality TV, and talk about a modest future like it was something we could build with our hands, and she used to look at me like steady meant safe. She called me her rock back then, not as a compliment she tossed out in public, but as something she said when it was just us, when a bill hit harder than expected, or her car made a new sound, or her boss talked down to her, and she needed to feel like at least one thing in her life didn't shift under her feet. I believed in that role more than I should have, because I was raised around men who measured love by how reliably you showed up, and I showed up the way I knew how, with overtime, with fixes, with problem solving, with consistency that didn't ask for applause. For a while, it worked because our progress felt like teamwork, and every upgrade was a little victory we shared. Like the first couch that wasn't secondhand, or the first weekend trip we paid for without checking the account 5 times first. The first crack wasn't a screaming match or some big betrayal, and that's the part that still bothers me because it started as a tone, a casual little shift in the way she talked about other people's lives like she'd been given a new measuring stick. It happened after a dinner with one of her coworkers, the kind of couple who posted every purchase online like proof they were winning, and Brittany came home quiet, not angry, not sad, just thinking, and I remember asking if she was okay and getting a quick, "Yeah, I'm fine." That didn't land right. After that, comments started slipping into our normal conversations like sand in a good engine, because she'd mention a guy's promotion the way someone mentions the weather, then glance at me like she was waiting for something I hadn't been told to deliver. She'd show me a photo of someone's new truck and say, "Must be nice." And it sounded harmless until it happened again, and again, until "must be nice" started to mean, "Why isn't that us?" even though she'd never admit that was what she was doing. And when I talked about my work, the long hours and the pressure and the way I was building a reputation that actually mattered, she'd nod, but her eyes wouldn't stay with me because she was already somewhere else in her head, comparing my steady climb to someone else's highlight reel. The worst part was how she made disappointment sound casual, like it was just a fact about me she'd accepted, because she'd say things like, "You're not really ambitious like that," with the same tone you'd used to say you're not really a morning person. I'd laugh it off the first few times because I didn't want to be a defensive husband, and I told myself she didn't mean it the way it hit, but it kept stacking up, and eventually I realized she wasn't describing me. She was resizing me to fit the story she wanted to tell herself. That's how it started, not with hate, not with yelling, but with a quiet change in the way she looked at my life, like it was something she was settling for, and once that feeling moves in, it doesn't stay small for long. By the time she flinched away from my touch years later, it didn't come out of nowhere, because the distance had been building in tiny, acceptable pieces, the kind nobody calls abuse until you're living inside it and you can't remember what warmth used to feel like. Kayla Reed showed up like a weather system Brittany pretended she didn't invite, because one week Brittany mentioned a new friend from work, and the next week Kayla was on our couch with a bottle of wine, shoes off, acting like our living room came with her name on the lease. She was freshly divorced, loud about it, proud about it, and she talked in those clean little internet phrases that sound empowering until you realize they're just weapons with good branding, because everything was bare minimum, everything was standards, everything was protect your peace, and somehow every example she gave was a man failing. The first night I tried to be polite because that's how I was raised, so I poured a second glass, nodded along, asked her questions, and waited for the conversation to naturally move away from relationships, but it never did because relationships were her whole personality now. And Brittany didn't push back, not even once, because she'd sit there listening like Kayla was translating feelings Brittany had been saving up, and every time Kayla said, "A real man would," Brittany's eyes would flick to me for half a second like she was checking a scoreboard. After Kayla became a regular, the energy in my own home changed because I'd walk in from work and feel like I'd interrupted a meeting, and Brittany would go quiet in that specific way that says, "We were talking about you and now we have to pretend we weren't." Then Brittany's mom, Susan Miller, got pulled into it, and Susan didn't storm in like Kayla. She slid in through FaceTime dinners with that polite, surgical tone, asking how I was handling responsibilities and whether Brittany was being taken care of, like I was on a performance review. Sometimes she'd say, "Brittany deserves stability," and it sounded supportive until you heard the implication, because she wasn't talking about bills getting paid. She was talking about Brittany getting the life she thought she was owed. That's when it hit me, standing in my own kitchen hearing two voices shape my marriage like a project plan, that I wasn't married to one person anymore, because I was married to a committee, and I was the only one in the room without a vote. The months after Kayla and Susan became background noise in my house weren't dramatic in a movie way. They were dramatic in the slow, exhausting way where nothing happens, but you feel yourself shrinking every day. Brittany started turning her back in bed like it was a habit she didn't even notice, and the silence became our default setting, because she could scroll for an hour without saying a word, then answer me with a flat that made it clear my voice was just another sound in the room. And I responded the way a lot of men respond when they don't know how to fight for intimacy without making it worse, because I tried to fix it with effort, which meant I cleaned more, cooked more, bought small gifts, apologized first, softened my tone, watched my timing, and learned how to read her mood like it was a weather forecast I was responsible for. I was doing emotional overtime at home and actual overtime at work, and when my boss finally pulled me aside and told me I'd earned a $5,000 bonus for how I'd handled a messy quarter, I didn't even feel proud at first. I felt relieved, because my brain immediately turned it into a peace offering. So I stopped after work, bought a bottle of wine that felt like a "We're Still Us" kind of bottle, came home carrying hope in my pocket like it had weight, and I tried to make the evening easy, not needy, not forced, just warm. Brittany barely looked up when I told her, and she didn't ask a single question, because her attention never left her phone long enough to meet my eyes, and later, when I reached for her in the simplest way a husband reaches for his wife, she recoiled like I'd crossed a line and said, "Don't touch me. I have self-respect," like my hand was an insult. That's when the bonus stopped being money and turned into proof, because I finally understood my wings didn't live in this home anymore, and no amount of effort was going to buy back a place she'd already mentally evacuated. After that night, I told myself I needed one evening that wasn't built around her mood, not to punish her, not to make a point, but to remember what it felt like to breathe without checking the room first. So I went to the gym after work, put my headphones on, kept my eyes forward, and let the repetition do what it does, because lifting is honest, and the bar doesn't care about your marriage or your pride, it just tells you what's real. Then I drove to my friend Chris Bennett's place for poker, which was our usual group, the same table, the same cheap snacks, the same dumb jokes, and for the first time in a while I felt normal again, like I wasn't a problem being managed. I didn't even check my phone much because I wasn't trying to hide, I just didn't want to spend another night reacting, and I kept thinking how ridiculous it was that a man had to sneak peace like it was contraband. Halfway through the night, the knock hit the door hard, not polite, not curious, but angry, and the room went quiet in that instant way men go quiet when they sense drama coming through the walls. Chris stood up to answer it, and before he could even get the door open all the way, Brittany pushed in like she owned the air in the room, with Kayla right behind her like backup, eyes sharp, phone already in her hand like she was ready to record my humiliation for later. Brittany didn't ask to talk, she announced, because she started narrating a version of our marriage that made her the exhausted hero and me the selfish villain. And she said it loud enough for every man at that table to hear, like she needed an audience to feel powerful. I watched my friends' faces, that awkward mix of concern and discomfort, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not rage, not panic, but clarity, because I finally understood she wasn't trying to solve anything. She was trying to win. She demanded I come home, right now, and Kayla added little comments under her breath about accountability and boundaries. And it was almost funny how they used therapy words like handcuffs. Old me would have started explaining, promising, negotiating, trying to lower the temperature. But instead I stood up calmly, folded my hand, set the cards down, and looked at Brittany like she was a stranger who had picked the wrong door. I told her I'd be home when I'm home, and my voice didn't shake, because for the first time I wasn't asking permission to exist. And the moment those words left my mouth, I saw the panic behind her anger. She tried to chase me out, calling my name like it was a leash, but I walked past her, grabbed my jacket, nodded at my friends to let them know I was fine, and stepped into the night air like I just left a loud building. Driving home, the city lights sliding by, I realized I wasn't running from an argument anymore, because you can only argue inside a relationship, and what Brittany brought to that poker table wasn't a marriage problem, it was a control problem, and I finally felt the part of me that used to negotiate go quiet. When I got back to the house, I didn't make up. I didn't apologize, and I didn't chase her into another circular fight, because I went to the spare room, shut the door, and for the first time I didn't reopen it just because she demanded it, because something in me had already decided the old rules didn't apply. The next morning, I didn't wake up ready to fight, because I woke up tired in a different way, the kind of tiredness that comes when you finally accept you've been spending years trying to earn basic decency from someone who treats you like a problem. I went to work, did what I had to do, answered the emails, sat in meetings, made decisions, and the whole time my brain kept circling back to one simple thought that felt almost disrespectful to say out loud, which was that I wanted out. At lunch, I drove to a quiet coffee shop I'd passed 100 times and never really noticed, because it was the kind of place people went to be left alone, and that was exactly what I needed, not comfort, not advice, just space where nobody could interrupt my thoughts. I opened my laptop, typed "Divorce Attorney Minneapolis" into the search bar, and my hands didn't shake the way I expected them to, because the moment I did it, I felt this strange sense of order, like I'd finally stopped pretending my emotions could solve a legal reality. I skimmed reviews, read a few bios, and wrote down 2 names on a napkin because I didn't want it in my phone where Brittany could stumble into it and turn it into another spectacle, and I realized how far things had gone when hiding a napkin felt safer than having a conversation. I picked one office because it sounded plain and professional, and when I met Amanda Lee a few days later, she didn't speak in drama or sympathy. She spoke in clarity, which is exactly what I needed, because she asked me basic questions and listened like she was collecting facts, not choosing sides. She asked about the house, the accounts, my income, Brittany's income, and whether there were kids, and each question felt like another light turning on in a room I'd been walking through in the dark, because it forced me to see the structure of my life instead of just the pain in it. Then she asked, calmly, if I wanted to try counseling first, and she said it like someone offering a normal off-ramp, and I surprised myself by answering instantly, because I told her no, and I heard how clean it sounded when I didn't decorate it with excuses. Amanda looked at me for a second and asked why, and I didn't give her a speech because I just said the marriage is dead, and saying it out loud didn't make me feel cruel, it made me feel honest. She nodded like she'd heard it before, slid a checklist across the desk, and explained what to gather and what to document. And it wasn't romantic or dramatic, it was practical. which turned out to be a relief, because my emotions had been spinning for months and her plan made them sit down. When I walked out of her office, I didn't feel happy, but I felt directed, because once you see the exit clearly, you can't pretend you didn't, and for the first time in a long time I wasn't guessing what to do next. A week after meeting Amanda Lee, I toured a small one-bedroom in Uptown that smelled like fresh paint and clean air. And the moment the landlord opened the blinds and the sunlight hit the hardwood, I felt my shoulders drop like my body understood peace before my brain could explain it. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't meant to impress anyone, but it had quiet, a simple kitchen, a door that locked, and windows that faced a street where nobody knew my name, which made it feel less like an apartment and more like a reset button I could actually press. I signed the lease right there with my pen shaking just enough to remind me this was real, and when the landlord dropped a cheap brass key into my palm, I realized it felt heavier than my wedding ring ever had, because this key represented permission to exist without being graded. I didn't announce it to Brittany, and I didn't threaten it during an argument because I stopped feeding the committee material, and I started moving my things out in small, silent trips while she was out, one trunk load at a time, like I was removing splinters instead of starting a fire. I took my work clothes first, then my personal files, then the things I'd miss if they got lost during a tantrum, and every time I carried a box down the stairs, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief, because the grief proved I had loved her, and the relief proved I was done. On the third trip, I was folding shirts into a cardboard box in our bedroom when I heard the front door open without a knock, and Susan Miller's voice filled the house like she'd been waiting for a stage cue. She stepped into the hallway, saw the boxes, and exploded into accusations about betrayal, selfishness, and how Brittany deserved better. And the wild part was how she spoke like she had authority, like my marriage was a family asset being repossessed. I didn't raise my voice and I didn't defend myself because I'd learned that arguments with Susan were designed to trap you into proving you mattered, so I kept folding my shirts, looked up once, and told her she should knock next time and return the key she'd been using. Then I taped the box, lifted it, and carried it past her while she stood there furious and stunned, because by then I wasn't leaving emotionally anymore. I was leaving physically, and the difference was that this time I didn't need anyone's permission to go. When Amanda filed and Brittany got served, the house didn't suddenly become sad. It became loud, because the moment the papers hit her hands, her confidence snapped into panic, and my phone turned into a siren that wouldn't stop. She called over and over not to talk like an adult, but to cycle through rage, guilt, bargaining, and that fake softness people use when they realize control is slipping, and every message had the same core demand underneath it, which was that I return to my old role and pretend this didn't count. When I didn't answer the way she wanted, Susan escalated from concern to performance, sending long emails that read like courtroom speeches, talking about how I was abandoning Brittany and destroying the family, even though the only thing I was destroying was the idea that they could keep grading me forever. Kayla joined in the way she always did, by posting vague quotes about toxic men and narcissists, like she was collecting internet trophies for a divorce that wasn't hers. And I watched them try to build a story where I was the villain so Brittany wouldn't have to face her own behavior. Then Brittany crossed the line that told me the panic had fully taken over because she showed up at my job unannounced, walked into the lobby like she owned the building, and demanded to see me, loud enough that people turned their heads and pretended not to. Security stepped in, HR got involved, and I stood there in a conference room afterward explaining, calmly, that this was personal, that I was handling it, and that I needed it documented because I wasn't going to let her chaos touch my career the way it touched my home. That night, I called my brother Derek Parker and told him the truth without dressing it up. And when he said, "I'm with you," and my friends refused to pressure me back into the marriage, something in me finally settled, because I understood I wasn't crazy and I wasn't cruel. I was just done. Derek's cabin in Door County wasn't some dramatic hideout. It was just a simple place where the air felt cleaner and nobody expected me to explain myself every 5 minutes. And after weeks of noise, that quiet hit like medicine. I drove up there to breathe, to sleep, to let my nervous system finally stop bracing for the next text, the next phone call, the next "you're the problem" speech from Susan or Kayla. And for 2 days I kept it simple, cooked basic food, took a long walk, and let the silence be silence instead of a punishment. On the third evening, right around dusk, I heard tires crunching on the gravel drive, and my first thought was Derek had come back early. But when I looked through the window and saw Brittany's car sitting crooked near the grass, something in my chest tightened with that old familiar warning. She got out fast, unsteady in a way that told me she'd been drinking, and she moved toward the cabin like she was marching into a courtroom where she expected the judge to be sympathetic. And when she knocked, it wasn't a knock, it was an order. I didn't open the door all the way, and I didn't invite her inside because I wasn't letting her turn Derek's place into another stage, so I stepped out onto the small porch and kept the distance between us like it mattered. Because it did. She started talking immediately, not apologizing, not asking, but demanding, telling me we needed to have a real conversation. Acting like she hadn't spent months avoiding every real conversation I tried to start, and the smell of alcohol on her breath made the whole thing feel more reckless than emotional. I told her, calmly, that she shouldn't be there, that she needed to leave, and that if she wanted to communicate she could do it through attorneys like every other adult who couldn't behave, and that sentence hit her like an insult because it removed her power to rewrite the rules mid-moment. She snapped back with the usual rotation, blaming me for abandoning her, accusing me of humiliating her, trying to tug me into guilt. And when that didn't work, she stepped closer and reached for my arm like she could physically pull me back into the role of husband. I moved back, kept my hands visible, and told her not to touch me, because I wasn't playing that game where she escalates and then claims she was the victim of my reaction. And for a second she stood there shaking with rage and disbelief like she couldn't understand a world where I didn't fold. Then it happened fast and stupid, the way accidents do when someone is angry and impaired, because she turned toward the dock to make a point, her heel caught on something uneven, and she lost her footing. 1 second she was mid-sentence, and the next she was in the lake with a sharp splash and frantic thrashing that didn't look planned or performative, and whatever I felt about Brittany in that moment didn't matter because my body moved on instinct. I got down to the edge, grabbed her coat at the shoulder, and pulled her toward the dock without letting her latch onto me, and I kept my voice firm and simple while I got her steady, because panic makes people do dangerous things and I wasn't going to add chaos to chaos. Once she was out, I wrapped a spare towel around her, kept my distance, and called for help, because I wasn't going to gamble with cold water and alcohol like it was no big deal. And when responders checked her over and confirmed she was stable, I drove her to a nearby motel instead of bringing her into Derek's cabin. At the front desk I paid for the room, got her inside, set water on the table, and told her she needed to stay put, and I stood outside the door long enough to hear the lock click, because I wasn't abandoning her in a crisis, but I also wasn't volunteering to be trapped with her again. In my car I documented everything while it was fresh, the time she arrived, the fact she'd been drinking, the fact I called for help, the fact I did not invite her inside, and the fact the fall was an accident that happened during an escalation she created, because I'd learned the hard way that the story gets rewritten if you don't write it first. Amanda didn't act shocked when I told her what happened because she didn't deal in shock, she dealt in patterns, and she said plainly that Brittany showing up intoxicated, forcing contact, and creating a safety incident strengthened the case for boundaries and formal separation, not reconciliation. A few weeks later the fight ran out, not because Brittany suddenly understood me, but because reality finally outlasted her tantrum, and when the divorce was signed I didn't feel like a winner, I felt like a man who had returned something that never belonged to him. The responsibility for her choices. When I closed the door of my uptown apartment that first night and the quiet settled in, it didn't feel lonely anymore, because it wasn't silence used as a weapon, it was silence I earned by walking away, and that difference changed everything.
Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. And trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.